Hello, all you amazing beings out there. We are MindFeelz, and today we are talking about individuation.
So, individuation is really when you have a highly developed sense of your unique self. It's relatable to autonomy, more of that. You have an awareness of who you are, what your needs are. You're able to separate yourself from others' identities. So, we want to spend some time talking about that. And Sheena, if you don't mind elaborating a little bit on your perspective on individuation.
So, a strong sense of self, I think, is where we're going with that to start, and building a strong sense of self within ourselves, and talking about where that really starts. And to start with myself, I would say that started when I was young, really learning. When I wasn't like my parents or wasn't the people that I was around, and how and when that shift started to happen. So I think it happens in multiple different times. I think it happens when you're young, then probably back in the teenage years, and then as the young adult years, and then shifting multiple times throughout my life. I think I've definitely felt that again and again. But really learning to distinguish my emotions from other people's emotions. And I think it's different for everyone. For myself, I'm an empath. I'm a very empathic person. So I know that is not the only way. And I know not everybody is super empathic and kind of lives in that way where you're absorbing other people's emotions and things like that. So I do want to say that, I know my experience of life is separate than other people's. However, I still think we all have to deal with figuring out our emotions from other people's emotions. And then we are given that opportunity in our relationships all the time. So learning that I'm separate than my parents, and then separate than my friends, and then again, as I get older, separate from my romantic relationships, and how to navigate that definitely started with my emotional self, I would say, and how that feels. I guess when you're feeling like, okay, well, somebody else, my best friend in the room, let's say, wants or desires a certain thing, and maybe I don't want that, is kind of where I started to learn to navigate that. And if I didn't feel that, right, that's where there might be a lack of a sense of self, where later on I might notice, oh, I didn't really want that, or I didn't really want to do that. And I think that's kind of how I started to notice it throughout my life. Can you talk about maybe where you notice that in your life?
Yeah, well, I hear you saying it sounds like it's something that is evolving. Your sense of who you are evolves. It's something that's established over time. And I think for me personally, it continues to be established over time through different things I face in life, or relationships, or just things that I decide I want to do whenever I, decide I'm interested in a new thing or whatever. You kind of start to pull it back to your sense of self. And for me, it's really that understanding of what I need, and learning to separate my needs from other people's needs, and my ideas and desires, and not taking on too much of someone else's desires and needs to the point where I overshadow my own. And it seems like it starts in childhood. We kind of learn for a long time, you feel like you're the same person as your mother usually, or whoever really is that person who spends the most time with you and nurturing you. For me, it was my mother, because she was a stay-at-home mom. So I really felt like a part of her for so long, and even up until my young adult life, aspired to be like her so much. And then almost felt this shock and clash when I realized I kind of didn't want to be the exact same person. I'm made a little bit differently. I thought for a long time I also wanted to be a stay-at-home mother, and that was an ideal that I put in my head. And then when I actually had a child of my own, realized that I like a balance between being able to give a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of nurturing to my child, but I also like the balance of putting towards some sort of work where I'm rewarded with, adult interaction and making money and contributing that way. So I started to learn, honestly, it took a little bit of time. It was something that I'm still understanding in myself of, I am my own person, I have my own desires, I have my own needs, and me wanting to honor those things and me wanting to explore those things more doesn't mean that I'm not living up to any ideal or any standard, and I don't necessarily have to take on who someone else is and what fulfills them as a measuring stick for what fulfills me. So it served me a lot, and not that I had an unhealthy relationship with my mom by any means, but learning that you're your own person and honoring yourself, honoring what you need, and awareness of your own feelings and your own desires. For me, that's really been the most strengthening thing of realizing kind of like wanting that autonomy. So,
I mean, I think there's I guess the opposite side of that, where there is times where I know I have struggled, where I've seen friends where I've read a lot of psychological information, where they talk about codependency, or where we get kind of addicted to another person, or we have a hard time separating ourselves from even our parents and things like that. So I think on the other spectrum, there's the healthy teaching of individuation and autonomy. There's the honoring of that as a parent and a child relationship, and then there's the lack, I think, of it too. So I think it's important to talk about all of this, because I think as we grow as a species, I think we need to talk about this stuff with our children. We need to be talking about this through our adult life, our young adulthood. We need to be reminded of this stuff and checking in so that we become better at noticing when there is a lack, or where there is something going on where that person isn't being given the ability to be their own person. So that for one thing for me that makes this very important is, I think, about the overall state of the human species and how we teach humans to be themselves and then respect others in being themselves, right? And then we can kind of start to mold this into romantic relationships, because I do think then again, right, you get this new leap when you do start to embark in romantic relationships, where sometimes it is a little confusing on how to be yourself and accept someone else as themselves and coexist in that space. And I think there's another really important surge of information that needs to be talked about and communicated in our romantic relationships in terms of having a healthy, strong relationship, to remain autonomous in those ways, but also respectful, right? And have relationships, because otherwise you're too, then you might not be having relationships.
Autonomy, someone who's autonomous and has that sense of individuation is able to function within relationships as well, because it's not like where you're someone who's going to isolate and exclude doesn't necessarily mean you're going to become reclusive and not be able to have intimacy. I think honestly, in those types, especially in those intimate, really connected, vulnerable relationships, you want to compromise, you want to meet the other person's needs, more so in a romantic relationship than in even a parent-child dynamic, because that dynamic, it's very obvious who is in the leadership position, who's responsible for looking out for the other person, and your child depends on you in a way that's unlike anything else. And then you step into an intimate relationship, and that term codependency gets thrown around a lot, but I think what that really is, we are made to be connected. We're made to be interdependent. Our, the advancement of our species depends on these relationships where we invest in each other on a deeper level than just, procreating and abandoning one another. That's not how we work. And we advance through those connections. But it can get tricky being entering into an intimate relationship and finding that balance of understanding yourself to such a level where you're not looking to the other person to fill every need. And you're also understanding that you can't fill all of theirs, and your needs aren't always going to be the same. And there's a level of learning how to respect each other and how to communicate. And I think a big part of that awareness of self, there's another level beyond that where, okay, I become self-aware. I realize my needs. Now there's another level of how do I begin to communicate those with the world around me and others around me so that I'm respected and I'm honored. But ultimately, you need to give to yourself first and recognize your own needs. You teach people how to treat you and love you. So that thing of, like we've talked about self-care, self-love before, it reflects back to that, knowing yourself in such a way where you are able to meet your own needs first. And you don't put that responsibility so much on another person. And you also don't take on responsibility for meeting all of their needs, creating their sense of safety.
Absolutely. And I think you asked the question, how do we communicate our needs? And I think that the best way to communicate our needs is to give those needs, communicate them. I mean, however way that you need to figure out what you need, what you desire, what that looks like, those self-care plans, those things that we did talk about, but then give that to yourself. And that is true in the case that you're teaching other people how to give you those needs and desires. And I think that gets a little confusing especially it seems like in romantic relationships, but I think it happens with all relationships. I mean, even work relationships that are a little bit shorter lived.
Yeah. Even those casual interactions, you still have those opportunities.
Because I think you end up like, you end up asking for stuff from other people and they can't give that to you for whatever reason. And then that drains us of that energy because we're relying on other people to give it to us, when if we give it to ourselves, we're not relying on the other people to give it to us. And then we're always coming from that full cup. And I think that is super important, but it is a practice. And myself, I still have to practice it all the time. I find myself drained from relationships, even past relationships. And I think, we started this conversation with the parent-child relationship because I truly believe that's really where a lot of this starts. Yeah. And we mirror those relationships as we get older. So, then we end up in those same relationships. So if it was an unhealthy relationship to start, there's, the process of forgiveness and working through that, right? But then always knowing that's kind of where a lot of those negative behaviors or those little spikes or triggers come from, and learning to manage those in a healthy way. And that, I think, really comes down to feeding it to ourselves. And it's a really hard transition to make coming from an unhealthy background. And I think, I would consider myself included in that. I think it's hard to all of a sudden turn it and make all my relationships positive and healthy, because I do look for things from other people. I do ask other people to fill needs for me.
Yeah.
It never works.
It's that impulse. It's the impulsive thing is like to do the thing when you're a child and you cry out for help, or you throw a tantrum, or you protest in some way when you feel like, oh, that need's not getting met and I don't like how this is going. But ultimately you're putting expectations on people that they don't even know that are there, and they're disappointing you, and they're not even aware that they are set up in that kind of a dynamic. You know what I mean?
Right.
And it can be really different when you enter into a relationship with someone who has this realization, this awareness, and this sense of individual self, and you don't have that quite mastered. I mean, it does come out. It does tend to create more conflict. There's heightened sense of conflict, put stress on the relationship, but that's also a tool. That's also how we become aware of where we might be lacking in this area. And I've experienced that. I'm not speaking on this from a place of I've mastered. I'm speaking on it from a place of this is a commitment I've made to continue putting effort here, because I've seen how it affects all aspects of my life when I am looking to others for too much. And it's something that I do tend to do. I'm a very sensitive. I'm very, I like deep connection. I like to feel secure. I like reassurance, and validation for things.
You're doing a great job.
Thank you. See, wasn't that nice? But at the same time, that can be very draining on another person who doesn't they're not necessarily understanding that you've got some void, because they don't have that same void,
Absolutely.
And not that there's anything wrong with needing those things or wanting those things, but I am learning in my adult life that I have to give them to myself. And wherever those holes were that I didn't get that in my childhood or in my young adult relationships or in my previous intimate relationships, I can see it, and it's good, and it's helpful to be aware of where the pieces were missing. But at some point, it's a shift in understanding that I can't ever change that. I can't fill those holes with those people. I can't go back and remake those relationships. I can do this for myself, and that's number one. And then future relationships and present relationships will be positively affected by that work I'm putting into myself. But ultimately, that focus, and it gets hard because when you're really empathic and you're very much like love people and you love that connection, you really want it with the people who are in your life, you really, really want to connect with them, you can tend to take on too much of wanting to fix when they might be feeling something negative,
and then you lose that sense of self.
You lose that sense of self, and you get drained, and you take on someone else's issues, or you put your issues on someone else and make it their responsibility, and then you feel powerless and resentful because you're not feeling good. And ultimately, it's not selfish to be autonomous, and it doesn't mean you can't have intimacy. I think it actually promotes true intimacy in all types of
because we're
relationships.
This is about being intimate. Mm-hmm. This is actual intimacy, I think, explained, because the better you know yourself, that's what intimacy is. Mm-hmm. Knowing yourself. That's really what it is.
That's where it starts.
Right. So if I know myself, then the people I'm around will know me because I'm living who I am.
That's right.
And that is and you can feel that. I think we feel that with our friends and family. I think a lot of times in my life, I tend to be around because I've always wanted that feeling. I was around a lot of people that did kind of reflect this more authentic being, because maybe I wasn't there yet, and I was like, well, what do they have that I don't have, you know? But you can feel it. You feel when somebody has a strong sense of self. You can feel when people are in their own shoes, so to speak. But I do think the pendulum swings far the other way. I think some people can be overly, like, have a strong influence on their surroundings and the people they are, because there's just different personality types. So extroverted people sometimes could mirror a strong sense of self, but maybe they, are hiding underneath pieces of themselves that aren't really themselves. They're just using that as like a dynamic to go around it. So we have to remember that true authenticity, it really still lies somewhere in the middle.
There's a balance.
Right. Yeah. And so getting to know yourself, like to sit down, ways to know yourself might be to actually sit down and write it down, right? Who I am, who I want to be, my desires, my needs as a human, going back to a lot of self-care tools, until you get that practice of, feeling that all the time. And I think that goes back to even what we talked about last week in self-love, is just that ability to ground yourself throughout the day, to not be too highly influenced by your surroundings. For me, working in the restaurant industry and being around a lot of different energies all day, I can sway, ebb and flow throughout the day, and I can come home and be a lot less myself sometimes, or even prior to going to work, kind of lose my sense of self because I'm nervous or I'm anxious or things like that. And that's just a practice for me every day to maintain that for myself. But I notice when I start to lose that sense of self and I go into these other influential energies, that I'm not as happy, I'm not as joyful, I'm not in that place that I want to be. And then I'm projecting that outward to the people around me. So this is why all this is so important, I believe.
It shows up, and I think we'll continuously come back to this point of learning who you are, awareness of self, and really learning how to, you have the highest influence over yourself. That's the person you have the greatest influence over. You will never be able to influence another person on the level that you are able to change yourself. So that is the absolute best place to start. If you're feeling like you're not getting what you need from a certain relationship, or from a job, or from an education path, or your lifestyle, your diet, your body, whatever, if you're not getting what you want and you don't feel full and you feel drained or conflicted or tense, the best place to start is with your own self. Dive into what you need and take time to assess that. And I think we get, we feel like, oh, we might be being selfish or navel-gazing or overly introspective, and it doesn't mean that you have to become, a reclusive person who doesn't interact with others or doesn't accommodate others. You can still be compromising with others, but you feel that lack, and it's going to affect those relationships and those interactions. And the best place to start, even if you're in a toxic relationship, say there is a traumatic, toxic, or abusive space that you're in, start with you, find out what you need, and then how do you get that? Sometimes it's letting go of that. Sometimes it's changing the way you interact with a person, or, learning how to communicate better, maybe things you aren't communicating, so you're stuck in this same spot. But ultimately, when we start with ourselves, getting to know who we are, getting a sense of we are our own dynamic self, and we're able to have these bonds with others that are interdependent and they're connected, and it doesn't have to be some, thing where we feel guilty if we're too attached to somebody or if we're not attached enough. I mean, ultimately, it begins to flow more naturally when we spend that time with ourselves and learn ourselves. So it might feel a little selfish, but when you neglect that, I mean, it might be worse for other people around you.
I don't think it's selfish. I think everything can be done compassionately. Mm-hmm. I mean, I know everything can be done compassionately. I'm learning because I think for me, because it was a transition out of a more traumatic space into a more healthy space, that at first it felt very selfish, and like I had to like put up maybe these walls to like figure out who I was, and then I had to like define who I was, and I had to tell everybody who I was, and like really feel it. But like as I grow, I realized that probably wasn't like necessary, but whatever, that was my process. But now I'm a lot more, it's confidence, it's respect for myself. It doesn't matter if someone else doesn't agree with me. It's not about them agreeing with me. Mm-hmm. It's about me just knowing innately who I am, what I'm doing, what I desire, what I need, and then just me feeling really comfortable in that, There was a time where I think my needs and desires where they were skewed, and I felt like I had to protect them because I really wasn't coming from an authentic place. I was coming from a defensive sort of place, protecting myself. So then everybody around me, of course, they didn't agree with me because I didn't agree with myself. And so it's taken me a while to like get to that place, and going into a little bit more of like the relationships in general. I think how we allow other people to experience themselves and be themselves, it just comes down to respect, and really respecting, your needs are different than my needs, and your desires are different than my desires, and I respect that you own your desires and needs. And I think when you have two, very whole people who are really know who they are, or 10 people that really know who they are, depending on the scene, but I think that it's easy to respect one another, but you do kind of have to do this work to figure out who you are first. I think it is a little hard in relationships where maybe one person doesn't know themselves and the other person does, and I think you touched on it a little bit, and it's a little bit harder there because one person is still figuring it out and maybe still has those defense mechanisms and still is struggling in those places, and it's just not our job to try and show them that, I mean, unless you're a therapist and that's like a different situation, but generally speaking, it's a family member, it's a relationship, it's a loved one, it's a child, it's a best friend. And if you want those people in your lives, unfortunately, sometimes you have to respect them and their path and where they're at. And even if it doesn't look like what you hoped for them, you can't allow your that door to open up to release all that energy to drain you. You just have to let them be. And I think that's also part of respecting ourselves and our needs and desires. So
yeah, and it's not, to elaborate on what you're saying, you don't necessarily have to broadcast like what you're doing within yourself and like these changes you want to make, and
you might think you do sometimes.
Sometimes you want to.
It's part of the process if you haven't been there yet.
Every once in a while, like, you do it anyway. But I think for me, that's something I've learned is I don't necessarily have to broadcast things. I don't necessarily have to share all of this, and even in the intimate relationship where I want to see the change, I find the way where I become the most effective and the most centered and really stay true to the fact that I'm doing this for me and I want to see changes in myself, taking that ownership, is just start doing the things. Like, just start doing the things and see what happens. Like, start finding out who you are, take the time with yourself, and then start doing the things. Act the way you want to act, treat people the way you want to treat them. And you'll get
what you want to see.
Responses, the relationships, the interactions, the job, the lifestyle choices, the things that aren't working will fall off. They'll just kind of like take care of themselves because, you know, it comes naturally, it really will. And that's just part of the process. And then the relationships that are meant to get stronger and they're going to respond well in the areas of your life that are truly going to nurture who you are and what you want will continue to get stronger the more that you nurture yourself and the more that you respect yourself.
There's a level of trust there that I don't think we're really talking about in this episode, but these work. This works.
It does.
This works.
It's not always comfortable. I mean, it's actually rarely comfortable.
Works.
But
if you give to yourself and you respect yourself and you move in that way, your world will adapt to that. And yes, sometimes it is weird and it's painful or uncomfortable. And I think it's more uncomfortable than painful. We might get that confused, but it is uncomfortable. But it's not going to fail. Mm-hmm. The fail is when we don't do that for ourselves and we remain in a comfortable place that doesn't suit us anymore. So I think that there's a lot of trust in that, but it works. And I think that's you just have to trust. If you put out the positive, you put out the good, you put out the right action, that's all that will come back.
Yeah.
100%. Every time.
Start with you, make sure you're healthy, you're good, you know who you are, you're respecting yourself. You can put out to the world, you put out what you want to come back to you. So if you put out that I love myself, I know what I need, I take care of myself, I respect myself, I honor the people around me, you're going to cultivate relationships, you're going to cultivate positive changes in your life that lead to that. And it's not like it makes you immune to pitfalls or bad days or mood swings or breakups or losing a job, you know what I mean?
Or even losing yourself for a month.
Yeah, I mean, you might have a really weird off period, but then you just get back on track and you'll still see positive if you just continue to do it. And giving yourself permission to really find out what your needs are and who you are is the best impact you'll make on your life and the people around you.
I agree.
So I'm Lauren Garrison.
I'm Sheena Dressel.
And we are
MindFeelz.
So please like us if you like us. Visit our social media pages.
Please subscribe.
Yes.
Hit the subscribe button.
And
please.
share it. Share it if you feel like it was valuable.
And if you have any questions, we're here to answer questions. If we can't give you the answers from us, I will go look for them. I'll find someone.
We'll find someone.
Yeah. There's a whole world of information out there. So please write us, leave comments, tell us what you'd like to hear about.
And we'll be talking to you all later.
Bye-bye.
Sounds good.
Ooh. I like it.